Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Brendan Aldrich, and I'm one of the founders with Invoke Learning, and we want to welcome you to today's webinar on Is Virtual Learning Creating New Gaps in Student Engagement? Today's presenters are Dr. Christy Lyle, who is the Executive Vice President of Instruction and Student Services for Foothill College, and Dr. David Ulate, who's the Executive Director of Institutional Research and Planning for the Foothill De Anza Community College District. We're thrilled to have you join us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We won't have audio turned on for the attendees today, but you will be able to ask questions by typing them into chat. We are monitoring the chat, and at the end of the presentation today, we'll be taking questions from the chat for Dr. Lyle and Dr. Ulate to be able to respond to. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. Christy, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to get us started on the first slide. Moving to the next slide. Here we go. Yeah, so I am going to start giving some context to the research project and giving a little bit of context and understanding of who we are. Foothill De Anza district is a two-college district. So we have two outstanding community colleges located in Silicon Valley in California. Our two outstanding community colleges are De Anza College and Foothill College. We are led by our Chancellor, Judy Miner. And we're going to focus today on Foothill College, but just to give you an idea of the number of students that we're serving, across the district, we serve about 60,000 students. And from a head count perspective, Foothill enrolls about 50% of the students. The slide does say that we have a strong presence in online education. And that is the case. So pre-COVID, just to give you an idea, we offered approximately, about 350 asynchronous online classes per quarter. And just so you know, we are a quarter structure. So we offer summer, fall, winter, and spring quarters. From that perspective of online classes, I would say our registration in online total annual is about 1,500 classes. So we really do have a lot of online presence. I'll start now with kind of the research problem, or, as most research projects start with a problem, right? And we're going to start with the very basic data, right? And when you see here, we're looking at our face-to-face and online difference, right? So the blue trend line shows you our course success in face-to-face and hybrid classes. And our green trend line shows you our course success percentages in our asynchronous online classes. And we do have an achievement gap. You can see that the course success here is different. And this would be course success is based on a C or better or a P for pass. This data total over time is about 48,000 students. So, when you think about, as the academic officer, I need to think about, this problem of how do we increase and encourage and do better as it relates to the online courses. As I evaluate and I help as a part of curriculum design and courses, we think about three major areas that are really important. Some you'll know are very basic, right? The cognitive acquisition. As we look at the student learning outcomes for any type of course. Bloom's taxonomy, we're familiar with the cognitive acquisition, and we're looking at, of course, knowledge, comprehension, all the way up to synthesis and evaluation. When we think about the student learning outcomes around skill acquisition, of course, we're thinking about how students take in and learn skills, from imitating to how to get precise with it, up to the concept of naturalization of that skill set. So are they learning from that top to bottom? And where we're focused today really is on the third component, and that is affect, and the acquisition and desire to engage in the class and be really a part of it. So the difference between the student who is engaged, but they're just there, right? Versus how do we get them into a class and really connected to the class so that they're valuing the information that is coming to them, they're learning that information, and they really want to be there. And we know from being, if you've taught or, how we work within classes, that has different impact. And it does also have different impact for our students of color and of ethnicity and race. So one of the things when we start with this data is that we have to be brave and we have to be courageous and we have to dig and drill deeper, which takes me to the next slide, which is taking the look, drilling into that gap. And we look here at our African-American students, our Latinx, Pacific Islander, and low-income students. And again, we can see from the success and the percentage of gap that we do even have a more significant problem as it relates to our students in the different ethnicities and race that you see here. And so as I engaged with the district institutional research and David Ulate and the Vice Chancellor Joe Moreau, who is the Vice Chancellor of Technology, they thought partner with me a lot. And I really used them to kind of go through problems and express them. And Joe Moreau knows about some of the issues that we're having. And as he's out and about and he's working in the field, he comes across a lot of new and innovative ways of looking at information and data. And that is where we started the project with Invoke. When David or Joe connect with me and they say, "Are you interested?" I always say yes, because it leads to really great projects. And in this case, when they presented the information and the way we would be able to look at the data, what I thought was really significant is that Invoke doesn't really look just at patterns over time. They're actually really looking at patterns of behavior. And when we think about these traditional ideas of cognitive acquisition, skill acquisition, and affect, and focusing on the affect piece, that's where we landed here today with the initial data that we've been getting and working through the analysis that David has done as it relates to engagement, affect, and that piece. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of context, kind of where we started, the problem that we're trying to solve, and that you can see through this engagement data. And then at the end, I'm gonna follow up with, after you see some of the data, to see some of the actions and ideas of how we flipped and changed a little bit around our professional development. So I will turn it over to Brendan, I think, next to start looking really at the data itself.
And in this case, we'll actually turn it over to David.
Oh, sorry, David.
So yeah, thank you. So as Christy has demonstrated, we all have sort of these traditional metrics of trying to identify gaps in achievement for our students. They can be gaps in progress or gaps in specific student success outcomes, grades, degree attainment, et cetera, et cetera. So we've done a lot of traditional metrics. But one of the things that's kind of missing in this context is some real-time data, and real-time data that will help us understand why the outcomes might be happening. And might be as important because we're focusing on correlation and not causation. I think sometimes folks can interpret it as like, oh, this, X means Y. It's like, not necessarily. We're showing relationships. So there is this debate between quantitative versus qualitative. And I'm absolutely in support of student voices, hearing directly from students. We're doing work around getting focus groups, folks getting questions, transcriptions, thematic coding, all that. That takes time and resources that sometimes research offices we don't necessarily have. And so what we're looking at is trying to kind of create this balance between quantitative and qualitative, and looking at behaviors in real time with real-time data. Data that is representative of what's happening right now and what we can do right now to try and improve the experiences for our students. So of course, why now? Well, COVID-19 brings a very unique context, especially as it relates to virtual learning. We've all had an incredible increase in online learning offerings and enrollment. There's been a large and a strong push of allocation of resources, laptops, hotspots, because we want to make sure that there's no gap in access by the students and courses and the resources that they have available to them to be successful. So now the question then is, how are they using these resources? Do we now see a disproportionate impact in this new virtual learning environment? This is getting at sort of that behavior. What behaviors, how engaged are these students in this learning behavior? And that's where the partnership with Foothill and Invoke really came together.
Thanks, David. I'm just going to join in here just for a moment to explain one part of the specific Invoke Learning solution that we've been working on with Christy and David. It was called Invoke Engagement, and it's actually a solution that has a variety of different ways that we're taking a look at student engagement, something that's very important now during the pandemic when we have so many of our students that are not really in that face-to-face environment. What you're seeing on the screen here is what we call our engagement chart or our engagement bullseye. And what we've actually done here is to take dozens of traditional and behavioral characteristics for every student to create a unique engagement fingerprint. That fingerprint is then assessed and mapped against every other fingerprint for the students that are currently enrolled for the term. So when they show up on the chart here, you're seeing them range, we call it from a score of 0 to 1. 0 is the center of that bullseye target, and then 1 would be the far outer ring. And in there, you'll go in increments from 0 to 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, and 1. Now, what that represents is all of the students you see clustering towards the center of the chart. Towards the 0. These are very aligned patterns of engagement. And the more that a student begins to drift or have a very divergent pattern, you'll see them drifting away from center and towards the edges of the chart. We've worked with some of our clients who have been able to tie this to student success and retention. Although I think what David and Christy and the Foothill team have been doing, and the focus of today's webinar, is something even really more fascinating in terms of how do we now relate this student engagement in ways that can help us ask new questions to help our students. David, let me turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. And one thing I want to clarify, and Brendan, you can actually probably chime in on this a little bit as well, is when we talk about engagement, it's not, I turn on my laptop, I log in, and I can sit back and I'm engaged. Like that's not, like, there's actual action happening. Brendan, you want to maybe touch a little bit on that?
That's right. And not only are there actual actions happening, but it's through, a lot of experience working with these tools and with the underlying data to understand which actions are more valuable than others. So for example, if you have students that are working inside of a learning management system, the fact that they've logged in, to your point, David, into the learning management system is not nearly as valuable as knowing what kinds of things are they doing within the system itself. Are they checking their grades? Are they posting to discussion boards? Are they engaged in chats and other activities? So what we do is we've actually gone through to curate. When I talk about those dozens of traditional and behavioral characteristics, is not only to bring out those specific actions, things like I checked my grade or I posted to discussion board, but we actually have created a very detailed and in-depth behavioral characteristics that we can extract about the students as well. Characteristics that drive towards student commitment, student grit, and drive for related courses. And all of these are then combined into creating that unique engagement fingerprint.
Perfect, thank you. And I think that's just really important because there can be some myths out there, like what engagement actually is all about. So what this tool has allowed us to do for Foothill students is look at their engagement behavior. And we can look at this bullseye. And so far, what it has provided for us is this overview. We look at all the students and how similar or dissimilar is their engagement behavior. And we can do this, we can compare different years, we can compare different terms, lots of different ways to slice the data. But one of the things to identify or to look at to see if there are gaps is to break the data down by student groups, right? So this general analysis gives some answers, but of course, answers beget new questions. And so that's where we started to go into, well, how do students, specific student groups, how are they engaging in this online environment? So here we have, and I'm going to try and just kind of walk through the data and this analysis. So what we've done is we took the source data from Invoke, and we have now broken it down by, we're looking at by engagement score. So what this one tells you, and you can see this, I'm sorry, race ethnicity by engagement score. And so think here in terms of columns. So looking at Black students, you see grand total at the bottom is 100%. So what we're looking at is what's the representation of Black students in each of those engagement rings? Same thing for Asian, Latinx, right? So we're looking within each group, what is their representation within each of the engagement rings? And what we see is, next slide. Oh, I should want to mention, what we're seeing is data for last academic year, 2019 and 20, right? And again, we can do this for a specific term if we wanted to. We could compare two different terms. What we're showing here is for a full academic year. Okay, so what we see is when looking at ethnicity, by race ethnicity, the vast majority, almost 90% of students are within those first two target areas, or within that 0 or 0.2 rings of the bullseye. And that's great. That means that the engagement behavior is aligned, right? Now what we want to do is we want to look at within the engagement score. So you'll see now the grand total of 100% is on the far right. That's because now we're thinking of in terms of rows. So when we look at the Black student population, Black students, if you look at the grand total at the very bottom, is 3.9%. And Asian is 31.1% of the full population. So now we look at, well, what's the representation within the engagement score of, let's say, 0, 0.2, 0.4, within each engagement score, when we look across the board, how does that representation compare to the grand total? Is there over-representation, under-representation? And so now here what we see is we start to see those differences. I'm just going to pause a little bit just for a moment to kind of let you digest what you're seeing. So here what we're seeing, again, over-representation or under-representation. So for Black students, looking at the 3 outermost rings in that bullseye visual, Black students and Latinx students are overrepresented in those areas. So for looking at Latinx, they represent about 23% of the population. They're about 32% of the outermost ring, about 37% in the 0.8 ring, and 34% in the 0.6 ring, right? So we see those differences. How does that compare to the other 3 groups? When we look at Asian, White, and Filipinx students, you can see what their representation levels are. 31% Asian, 25% are White, 5% are Filipinx. And when we look at their representation, again, within those outermost rings, we see that they are underrepresented, or their proportionality is underrepresented in those outermost rings. So look, using Asian students as an example, 31% of the population, they're 25% in the outermost ring. They're 20% in the 0.6 ring. Now, I don't have a slide, but just to give the context, because a lot of researchers, a lot of people will say, well, what are the ends? How many students? Like, yes, the farther out you go, the fewer students you have. So that, for instance, that 17.9% for Black students, it's a relatively small number. But it still demonstrates an overrepresentation, right? So even though the ends might not be thousands of students, they still represent students. They still represent a reality that certain student groups are exhibiting behaviors different than other student groups. So this is by race, ethnicity. That's one student group. We also did it by student type. And so I'm gonna pause because I just threw it all out on one slide. You're just gonna do a little bit of a pause, let you digest. Color coding is the same, right?
David, we did have one question, as long as we're pausing to
Sure.
let people take a look at the screen, is is the divergent pattern representative of less engagement only, or could it be representative of both less engagement and more engagement than the norm?
Great question. Great question. And what the data, and Brendan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what the data show, or what that different engagement represent, it just represents different. It could be off the chart. So let's say I'm a student. Let's say the average level of engagement on a scale of 1 to 100 is 20. Let's say I'm at a 20. It could be that my engagement score or another student's engagement score that's really different is a 1, or it could be that the score is an 80, right? So it could be just vastly different. So that's a point of conversation, right? So now when we use this data, and Christy will talk a little bit about this later, how we use this data is to provide context for conversations that lead to actions, right? So when we look at these data and we break it down even more, we start looking at, well, what classes, what types of students, this and that, we can start to think about, well, why might these behaviors be happening?
And I think this is the question that gives us the next kind of problem to solve and the direction that we want to go in terms of how do we look for correlate data or correlate information. We can't make assumptions, but when we also see the original data from the slides that I presented that we do have a success issue, we have to really then unpack and look at the engagement score and understand that more deeply as it relates. And this is where, you know, we really are coming to a relationship with the faculty where this is not about a judgment. This data is different in that it's not a judgment, right, on a faculty member. This is about a relationship between how do we find more information to start to really look at this new and innovative way of seeing a metric. The metrics just aren't out there in terms of looking through online classes to really understand behaviors. So I think, I mean, it's a wonderful question. I think that was Sarah Cooper. It's the perfect question for, you know, getting excited about what we can learn more deeply as we continue through the process.
Yeah, and I'll also, in a couple of slides, I'll touch a little bit about with next steps of data analysis, additional relationships that we'll make that will also hopefully shed some light on that. So with student, Brandon, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say one thing that I could add in from some of the work we've done with other colleges is, whereas it's true that it could be somebody who's divergent because it's a much more positive activity, we find that, at least in the work we've done with our other clients, is it's much less likely. It's certainly more likely that the divergent pattern is not a positive engagement pattern for success. But to answer your question very directly, yes, it is very possible.
You know, I just think it's important to note too that this gives us a different perspective too, where we're not taking a deficit model on either population. It's not the students, it's not the faculty's fault. What we're trying to do here is really look at the relational piece of it, looking at behavior and engagement and trying to understand how we come together rather than kind of taking that deficit mindset. I think that's important.
Yeah. So in looking at this slide, so we did it by student type. Continuing students are those that have been enrolled in the college consecutive terms. Concurrent is dual enrollment. I'm sure that might be a term that's more familiar for folks. It's a high school student who's taking classes at their high school and also at the community college. First time are students who are first time not only to Foothill College, but to post-secondary education. And that's an important distinction because then first time transfer are those who are new to Foothill, but have post-secondary experience, be that at another community college, at a 4-year, something like that. Then returning students are those that were enrolled at Foothill, but that took a couple of terms off, well, off from Foothill at least, and then have come back to Foothill. And what we see is the overrepresentation in the outer rings are the concurrent, the high school students, and the first-time students. Underrepresentation in the other three, which suggests that those students who have post-secondary experience are exhibiting behavior that's more in alignment with their peers. Okay, so when we think about then the original question, is there a disproportionate impact in the new learning environment? Answer, yes, we are seeing that. And what it does for us is then it provides context for the strategic conversation and actions and additional analysis, which I'll get to a little bit. But it gets to the point we were talking about before. Now, as the executive director for research and planning, I often say, or not always say, what the data analysis is meant to do is provide context for conversations. It's not here to tell you what, it's not a silver bullet, not here to tell you what you need to do or have to do, but it hopefully will give you an area to give an important context for how you think about what's happening. And in this case, with this data, it's how you think about what's happening like right now. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christy. She can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things about Foothill that I am really proud of is that we really work to think about data not from a punitive perspective, but more from the continuous improvement and being good reflective practitioners. And sometimes that does take courage and it gets scary, especially when you start to see these new and different types of metrics. And what we have what we've been doing is we were very lucky in that when we converted due to COVID, we were right at the end of our winter quarter. And we then started our spring quarter. And what we did was we shortened the length and added in some extra professional development. And so we've really been working on kind of switching away from necessarily the traditions of training around, we use Canvas as our management system, and thinking about what does the course structure look like. So it's one thing to think about how do you put your modules in, and that notion of, which is very typical in a online course, is I'm going to give you points for engaging in this activity. And what we've really tried to change our mindset in professional development to how do we create a relationship for the student to the course and to the faculty member. And one of the models that we changed to was, rather than having our online experts, which we do have a lot of those, well, not a lot, we have an office of 4 in our online, but we have faculty liaisons who have release, who are really acting in the peer role. And we've switched to more of a peer model. And so in that training around the relationship, we have engaged in professional development learning communities. So we also have a full-time professional development liaison or director, and she reports into the Office of Equity. And this is where we really are focused on the differences in relationship building across different types of populations and using this data to help inform that. And just to give you an idea, and I can, I'd be happy to talk in more in depth. So I'm just giving a kind of a high level. We have both the professional development, which is very typical in our focus, but it is centered around learning communities of faculty. Or cohorts of faculty in a particular learning community. And then we do have what we call is POCR, is our peer online course review. And we have faculty who are trained, who then engage in a review, a pretty extensive review of another faculty member's course, and helps them with this concept around engagement and the relationship of that. And just to give you a couple of the headers for the learning communities, we have, it's called 10+10+10 communication, which is the first 10 minutes, the first 10 hours, the first 10 days of the online class. And how are you going to capture and build in, as I was talking about, the affect piece and that engagement piece and the relationship piece to the class. Another learning community is humanizing your course, and that using the learning management system and all other types of tools to do that. And then another one is your personal equity plan. So what is the faculty member's equity plan, and how are they creating the course then to think about, as we're looking at that data of gap, how are they engaging all types of students, and making sure that there's real relationships built in, and that the students are not just there, but they really value being there. They value the learning that is being presented to them, and that acquisition is strong, and we really get into those high levels of knowledge and skill acquisition. I'll stop there and have David, I think, talk a little bit more.
Sure. So what's next with Invoke Learning? And the reason we highlight that is the tool that we've used to look at engagement is just one of a larger set of tools that we have with Invoke. We look at, there's engagement, we just got a student success, so we can now start looking at relationships to student grades in courses. There's different levels or different types of engagement. We looking at stress indicators. So there's this treasure trove of data, really. And so now it's really about trying to bring those pieces together. So in my mind, one of the things I start thinking about is what my team, what we can start doing is just imagine if on a daily basis, we can provide for the college some type of report list, something that says, hey, here are some students that we already see in week 2 of the quarter that are exhibiting behaviors that suggest they're not going to be successful in their outcome, right? So hopefully we can create a system where we can start doing some early reporting, so that the college can act a lot sooner, a lot quicker. And we can also provide analysis, like I said, around student success. When we look at engagement, one of the things we've already seen is at what time of day are students normally engaged in their classes. And so we adjust practices. Can
I interrupt there?
Yeah, go for it.
So there's 2 things that you talked about. The first being like knowing the times, and real-time data around then being able to adjust our support services to students as it relates to being engaged in the system. We also have what we call tech ambassadors, which are our students who were, in terms of work study, were having different jobs on campus who aren't working right now. So we have helped bring them into our process to better support the online classes. So the tech ambassadors, so we can schedule them so that they're also supporting faculty and students as students are logging into the system. And that would be whether it's asynchronous or synchronous Zoom, lecture period, et cetera. And I think that in terms of being able to respond and react, I think that's the other piece that David was talking about is somewhat, it models a little bit of an early alert system. And so we do have a traditional early alert system at Foothill, but it does require the faculty member to notice that. And our faculty are really great about that, and then they need to then send an email, et cetera. But this allows us to have a different and newer metric that can supplement our traditional early alert system, where we can be alerted to divergent behavior once we kind of unpack and kind of see what are some of those behaviors as they go into that outer band. And then we would be able to then connect and provide different supports for students depending on what that need would be. So we're not there yet, but there's definitely a lot of things that we're looking at supplementing our traditional services that we can get even specifically more focused and fine-tuned, so that we are responding more quickly to encourage student success. Sorry, David, keep going.
No, that's great. And it just reinforces one point I was going to make, because I saw that question also in the chat, is what's unique and incredibly helpful with these data is it's real time. Like these data, they're refreshed every day. And so we can see today what happened, or what happened as of today, what happened as of yesterday. So it's real time. We don't necessarily have to wait for a week or 2 weeks for things to get processed and outcomes to be reported out to us. So with that, I know, so it's just to say there are a lot of different tools that we work with Invoke on, and now it's just trying to bring it together. So I'll turn it over to Brendan to talk about those tools.
Hey, thanks, David. Not a problem. And by the way, I know we have a lot of attendees today from the California Community College system. And just as a bit of insight, we are working right now to put together a statewide master services agreement with the foundation so that it would be easier for us to be able to work with each of the individual campuses and districts if it's desired. But as David mentioned, we do have a variety of products that focus around most of the strategic questions that we tend to focus on in higher education, whether it's improving enrollment, increasing engagement, which is what we've been talking about today, increasing enrollment, retention, so the term-to-term retention and the year-over-year retention. Student success, we actually do have a product we've been developing in conjunction with the California Community Colleges called Invoke Enrollment Tracking, which is an application that allows colleges for the first time to really manage to their enrollment goals every single day. And then finally, our Invoke Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's really fascinating. The work my partner Lige Hensley and I had done up to and including Invoke really had not focused on biographic and demographic characteristics because in many ways it could be interesting that, looking at myself, a bald middle-aged white guy from California wearing glasses could be struggling in Math 118, but those aren't the characteristics that's going to help a college know how to help me and how to support me in my educational journey. In working with the college customers and clients that we've had over the last year, really it became clear that no, that's not really what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about. It's really about how do we better understand where those equity gaps exist and how do we start to ensure that every student has the same exposure to and the same opportunities within the environment of higher education. And really that's been our focus for the diversity, equity, and inclusion product as well. And then I know there was one question that came through, David, in terms of how long does it take to get up and running with Invoke, maybe from your own experience, because as we know, a variety of other analytics companies can take a fair bit of time, months or even over a year. Can you talk a little bit to your experience in terms of what kind of effort it took on your part and how much time it took to get up and running?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I mean, it took very little time. I would say the delay was always on my end to try and get Invoke the access or the data and get them going. I would say, you know, the funny thing is we actually originally partnered with Invoke to do a different type of analysis. This was pre-COVID, and then when COVID hit, Brendan came to me and was like, "Hey, how about we think of this way?" And then I talked to Christy, and we were all like, "Yeah, this would be awesome." And from that point to when we started to actually get some data, I would say, wow, maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or so, because again, it was just a matter of me getting the data to them. And we continue, and what's great too is we continue to refine it. I was like, oh, when I talked to Christy or I talked to Foothill's Dean of Online Learning, from that conversation, I was like, oh, we need to add this one other data point, or let's try this other data point. And I'll go to Invoke and I say, hey, can we add this? No problem. I send it to them and they add it. So it's also an evolving process of analysis, which is great. But from idea to some level of analysis, I would say, yeah, it is no time at all.
And it's certainly, I think we find it advantageous in Invoke Learning. My partner Lige and I both have spent a decade working within higher education. I've worked with the City Colleges of Chicago, with Ivy Tech Community College of Indiana as their Chief Data Officer, and even more recently as the Chief Data Officer for the California State University System. So having that kind of on-the-ground experience is something that's really helped us to be able to ensure that the way that we're able to work with our colleges like Christy and David is something that's actually going to be more immediately relevant and more directly helpful to the challenges that they want to tackle. Having said that, Why don't we go ahead and move into our question and answer period. And again, for everybody that's on the call, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat window. And we'll go ahead and have Christy and David respond to the different questions as they come in. In the meantime, Christy, I don't know if you wanted to sort of talk about, you've been talking a fair bit about the next steps that you're planning with these insights. Any more that you can share on that while we're waiting for our first few questions?
Well, Brendan, I was thinking too about maybe sharing some of if you could do a little overview of the capture of stressors and thematic wording across because that is an area that I'm looking that we want to move forward in, because that's where we can really make the collaboration between student services and academics to come together to provide more supports to students, especially during COVID and this time of stress. So would you mind doing that? And then I can follow up too a little bit around some of the things we're thinking about.
No, absolutely. And as Christy was mentioning, one of the things that we're able to do with Invoke and part of the Invoke engagement solution that we've been providing is that kind of textual and contextual analysis. So we've been able to bring in all of the discussion board posts and all of the messages that students are sharing within the learning management system in order to not only get an idea of what are the topics and themes they're discussing. And this is important because this goes well beyond the kind of word frequency and word clouds that we're kind of used to when we're doing free text analysis. But we can actually define topics and themes to extract, such as we did around the pandemic. And one of the things that we saw very quickly was that, especially as students went home during the spring semester, that there was this huge uptick in discussions on pandemic-related topics and themes. But one of the things that's very interesting is we can actually go through now and do a stress analysis on that, regardless of topic and theme. We can look at capitalization, word positioning, word patterning, punctuation, and start to get an idea of stress and anxiety that are being experienced by students. Now, when we took a look at that same shelter at home, when the students were sent home in that term, we could see that whereas student discussions had skyrocketed to the point where, you'd think a rock and roll band was playing on the campus that night, but their stress had increased as well, very dramatically. Not as much. They weren't as stressed as they were discussing it. Although, and that was around day 66 of a term. Down around day 94, 95, we saw this huge spike in stress that was not correlated to discussion. And what that was state shutdown orders. So we could be able to tell and be able to share with the Foothill De Anza team that there was this dramatically increased stress that was going on within the student communities, but that it wasn't necessarily related to discussions around the pandemic, but from a timing standpoint, we were able to see that it was related to the state shutdown orders. What was fascinating about this work is that we're able to do that, as David mentioned, every single day. So every day we can take a look at those top trending topics and themes and the stressors that students feel about it. I think the first surveys on student stress during the pandemic came out about 6 weeks after the students were sent home. Now, we were at that point, I think, already 4 or 5 weeks into looking at these stressors every single day. And one of the things that we saw was that the surveys that were conducted on student stress were already well out of date by the time they were published. 5, 6 weeks later, they were talking about student stress more than doubling. We were able to see that at its peak, student stress levels had increased over 6 times normal levels expected at that point in the term. So that was something that was certainly very valuable for us to be able
and so I haven't had as much time to dig into the data, but what I saw is what Brendan is really talking about is this notion of being able to respond much more quickly. I mean, we can do a survey. It takes us time to write the survey. We have to get, again, I'm looking for this new way of thinking, and that is quickly in real time, that then I can provide the associate vice presidents and the deans with this type of information so that they can also share it with faculty, or that we can, engage our psych services, our counselors, and our support structures to quickly respond and react. And even You know, we engage a tremendous amount with our student government, and they do town halls. They've been doing periodic town halls with a lot of very topical things, but it would be information that we could share as a whole to really be able to respond to the things that are affecting students. I think that also creates a better relationship, right? I mean, if we know them and we can see how, when they're stressed, and we can respond and react with supports, I think, in a quick way, I think it allows for that holistic approach where they're feeling connected to us, that we understand them and that we care about them, and we're not behind it. So this data is fascinating to me, to be able to, especially as a qualitative person, to quickly get this, which would take us months to be able, and manpower to be able to do it. So I'm really excited. That's definitely future. I can't speak too much to it. I think Brendan understands the data and gave you a good overview, but I'm excited about it.
And here I just was able to pull up from one of our demo environments. So this is not specifically related to Foothill's data, but this is the type of analysis we were talking about, where you can see discussions around the pandemic topic skyrocketed very quickly. And here below that, what you're seeing is the stressors. And you're seeing that whereas up above here, we were peaking at around 800 instances per day, stress levels were around maybe 130 initially, before finally peaking here at nearly 180 instances per day of stress detection, stress-related detections in the messaging, which really told us, and this is the point where I was talking about, that we were over 6 times normal levels of stress for that point in the term. And this is also one part, and I think you may have seen it on the slide we did earlier, but we do have other components of the Invoke Engagement solution. The LMS engagement is what we were looking at earlier in today's presentation, but we've got usage, student map analysis, online meeting usage, and then even this discussion topic analysis.
And I think there's even like a quick top 10 hot topics that we could pull on a regular basis. Again, super excited to work together. And this is where I think we can really bring our student services and our academic affairs together to really do some good work. Brendan, there's actually a question. Can you use this can you use this to view student engagement by faculty member or department, not as a punitive measure, but an early intervention for faculty who may be struggling with equitable engagement in their classes?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, it varies from school to school, and the topic can be very sensitive. And a lot of that can be culturally based on the historical relationship between administration and faculty. In the case where if you wanted to take a look at faculty engagement, that is absolutely possible. And we do have college customers that are using that now in order to be able to determine, for example, are there very divergent patterns of engagement in certain faculty roles, where they can now direct the resources and the support they have to those faculty members in order to bring them back into that overall engagement pattern. And that's been working very successfully for the colleges that have been able to do it so far. And then I see a question from Megan as well. Let's see, how are you notifying students about this intensive new use of their data? Are students given an opportunity to opt out? Christy or David, do you want to talk about the approach or the thought behind that?
Yeah. So as executive director of research, I also do IRB at the college. So I would say that we have all the usual, the same IRB protocol in place. We have in our contract, in our contract with Invoke, we have language specifically talks about how data are to be used, not to be used, et cetera, et cetera. There's no identified student names, no SS, social security number, nothing like that. So it's a research protocol for how the data are used and how the analysis are used. And what, excuse me, and what the end user see is always just aggregate level, right? So student identity, students, all of that is always protected.
And it's something interesting that I can bring up as well. Because my partner Lige and I came from higher education, that idea of student privacy was also very important to us. Every solution that we have has been designed to require absolutely no personally identifiable information at all. In fact, many of our agreements, such as the one we have with Foothill DNs, actually specify that they are not to provide us any personally identifiable information because, frankly, it's not necessary. As we talked about it, I don't need to know social security numbers, bank account numbers, or any of the kind of information that you would normally have another analytics organization asking for in order to provide these kinds of more innovative insights that we do. So it does make it much easier from a relationship perspective because we don't have to necessarily worry about is there a potential breach of data, what data could be identified. On the other hand, the college is completely empowered to take all of the data from our applications and bring it back into their own systems and tie it back to personally identifiable information should they wish. And this is where, we can do some of that, I should say not we, but the college can do more with the data. As David mentioned, he was able to take our engagement scoring, download that data from our engagement chart, and then be able to tie that back to some of the other ethnicity data to do further analysis with it. Our approach has always been not replacing the analyst or the researcher as much as it is really about supporting and augmenting capabilities for research and analysis within the institution. Oh, sorry. And then have you told students that, for instance, their discussion posts will be analyzed by someone other than their instructor? And David, can you talk about if that's something that's covered by the IRB approach?
So because it's research data, we haven't specifically reached out to every student to inform them about this particular work. We have worked with student groups in the past to let them know about research that we have been conducting. So students are aware of research that is happening at the institution. This one in particular, because of the anonymity and the other IRB protocols in place, that we have not specifically reached out to students to individually let them know, to tell them exactly that this particular research is happening.
Now, there was also a question that Tracy Nunley had asked in regards to, is the data ever resold or anything along those lines? And the answer again there is no. That was something that we always, my partner and I had companies come talk to us about when we were working for our colleges. Everything we do within our environment is single tenanted. That means your data is never merged or conjoined with the data from any other college. It is all unique to you. In fact, we often heard from different companies who wanted to work with us about how every college thought of themselves as a snowflake, but that no vendor actually really believed it. Lige and I had spent enough time with the data from so many different colleges that there is culture and history that is represented within the data that is lost in a lot of the solutions that are available today. Everything we're doing with Invoke Learning has been designed to preserve that culture and the history within the data, and leverage that to provide solutions that are not only specific and relevant for each college, but are delivered back in the vocabulary of that college. So, for example, if you are using an application that was built by someone else and they designed it for a college that was, somewhere that you're not, one of the first things that they do with you when they begin working with you is to ask every college to remap their data into the data model that they built for that original college, wherever it happened to be. And in doing so, you now have to learn new language, because it might be that if they were a PeopleSoft school, they call a part of term a session. If you're a banner school, you're calling it a part of term. So now you've got this new vocabulary that's being introduced in addition to having to understand if the data is being really relevant to you. All of that goes away with the approach we're using at Invoke Learning. The data is yours. It's never conjoined or sold to anybody else. It is used to provide you with very relevant insights to your students at your institution. And the results are delivered back to you in the vocabulary that you're already using. We had another example with a college who was looking to improve enrollment. And our solution started picking up and tracking a contributing factor to enrollment for them was this program. Let's call it JCB. It was an acronym that we had no idea what it was. The college was thrilled because JCB turned out to be an acronym for a program they had initiated specifically to increase enrollment. And so the fact that Invoke was able to identify that and surface it without them needing to tell us about that program or us needing to be aware of it was something that they found exciting. And any other questions? I know we're getting down, we just have about 4 minutes left, so we probably have time for one more question if there is one out there. We'll give it just a second to tie in there. But while we're waiting for that, first of all, let me thank you, Christy and David, for the time you've taken to share with everybody today the results you've had working with the data and sort of the exciting next steps really that you have, as we talked about going beyond laptop and hotspot loaner programs to sort of dive more deeply into equity and to be able to start asking that question, what next? What should we be looking at and where else can we go? And it looks like that's it for us. So everybody, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar and for being a part of our presentation today. We will be sharing a link to the video for this and being able to share more questions. If you have other questions that do come up, please feel free to email any of us. You can reach me, brendan@invokelearning.com. Christy, David, do you want to provide your email addresses?
I actually dropped mine into the chat.
Very good.
I'll do the same.
Perfect. And I'll go ahead and I'll leave the webinar session open for the next 3 minutes so that you can capture the email addresses from the chat. I'll put mine in there as well. But having said that, I, again, just wanted to thank everybody for attending and we'll look forward to talking with you soon. David, Christy, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.